Good evening, aviation enthusiasts. I'm Jamie Beckett, AOPA Foundation's You Can Fly Ambassador for the Eastern U.S. Fit that on a business card. Over there is my buddy Pat Brown, who is the You Can Fly Ambassador in Texas. Our counterpart, Kay Sunrum, would have been here tonight, but a little bit of headwinds and a little bit of Southern California traffic says she is stuck on a highway right now. So, hi, Kay. Best of luck to you.
Good luck.
We've got Donnie in the background, Donnie McKay, who is our producer, and we revere him. Pat and I believe we have both committed to buying very large, extravagant Christmas gifts for Donnie because he makes us look like we're smart.
I got a $3.98 budget.
That's plenty. You'll have change back from your dollar. Tonight, we're going to talk about part 2 of what did we learn as CFIs, certified flight instructors, because, it's certificated flight instructors, isn't it, Pat?
That's correct.
Oh, I get it wrong sometimes. I'm sorry. But as always, you can talk about whatever you want. You can go ahead and put notes in the comments section. We actually see them right over here. Of course, Pat sees them on his side, and we'll actually address them. So let's jump into this, talking about lessons we've learned as a CFI. And Pat, I got to say, the first 2 flight schools I went to were not good. And that's being kind. It really is. I had no idea what the process was. I never did a pre-flight brief. I never did a post-flight debrief. I had no idea what any lesson was going to be. My second instructional lesson was a cross country. I didn't know that was stupid. When you learn to be a CFI, and I mean, that's separate from getting the certificate, but when you learn to do the job, one of the things you learn is a lesson has a structure. Any lesson, it doesn't matter if you're working with a pre-private applicant or an instrument applicant or a commercial, there's a structure to it. How did you find out how to do that, and how do you incorporate it into what you do?
Well, if you want to fall asleep learning the process, then just pick up the fundamentals of instruction, a fine FAA publication. But it'll put you to sleep after about the first 10 minutes. But one of the really good things in it is there's a lesson plan template, if you will. It basically starts with objectives and it goes down the list. And at the end, it's a summary of what things that you have to do to basically show that you've accomplish the objectives that were stated up at the top, the elements that you have to have completed. So, in the most formal sense of the word, or the term lesson plan, that would be it. It's actually a written document, and you follow it step by step by step.
Yeah, I've got to admit, the first flight school I worked at, also not a great flight school, I'm sorry to say, and I didn't stay long because it wasn't a productive environment. But I really learned to be a CFI from a guy named Frank Gallagher, who I talk about periodically. He was my chief instructor in Connecticut. And that's where I really learned, to treat each student as an individual, to actually have a structured lesson. I had a desk where I'd go sit down. We started each lesson at the desk, sitting in chairs, talking about the lesson. Then we went and did the pre-flight, blah, 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 blah. But boy, that was an eye-opener for me when I realized, I had eventually gotten to a good flight school where I got my tickets, being able to incorporate that where there's record keeping and there's a structure to things, and the student matters more than the time going into my logbook. By the way, Mike Roberts says, hello from Maryland. Pat, we're triangulating America. I got Florida, you got Texas. Mike has Maryland, we're good. And Connor Wilder says, any idea how I can do a letter of recommendation and FAA SOTA? You want to take what a SOTA is, Pat?
Well, a SOTA stands for Statement of Demonstrated Ability, and it kind of depends on what the SOTA is for. If it's for monocular vision or color blindness, it's actually not called a SOTA anymore. It's called Special Medical Flight Test. But Connor, you're going to have to be more specific. Are you attempting to get a SOTA so that you can exercise the privileges of your certificate? You got to be a little bit more specific. But what I would recommend perhaps is to email me, pat.brown@aopa.org, pat.brown@aopa.org, and be a little bit more specific on that question. You're certainly welcome to elaborate here, but that may be too complicated to try to answer here.
Yeah, and I'll add in, Connor, if you're an AOPA member, you can call the Pilot Information Center during business hours, and they'll talk to you. But writing to Pat, it's a great way to go. He actually does know what he's talking about. He's kind of smart. And Jennifer Johnson, all the way from Oregon, we have triangulated the entire nation now. Life is good. I just mentioned, Pat, that not all students learn the same way. I think that's as important for the student to know as for the CFI to know, because I can walk into a flight school, and because you were successful using this method as a student doesn't mean I will be. Some of us need to see things. Some of us need more conversation. Some of us have different aspirations. Maybe I'm learning to fly because I have a fear of heights or flying and I have to do it for business. Maybe I'm learning to fly because I want to do it for career. Has that been your experience as well? That student, the applicant, whatever, has to be treated as a unique individual, not as the next body jumping into the airplane.
Yeah, that's true. Everybody learns differently, as you said. It's our job as CFIs to essentially to be chameleons. We should conform to the student's needs, not vice versa. And so if you're a student or a learner, I think as we're supposed to be referring to them now, and your CFI is insisting that you learn one way and you don't learn well that way, then you're within your rights to say, something, I need to get a different instructor.
Yeah. That is one thing. I was very lucky. I learned it in my commercial multi-engine training, but I really put it into practice as a CFI. It's not an insult to say I'd like to use a different instructor. The instructor may be great and you may be a very competent student, but you just don't connect well. And I will say, as a CFI, I've had a couple students, learners, who I just wasn't making progress with after a certain point. We did well in the training up to a certain point, and then it just kind of stopped.
Yeah.
And I couldn't help them get through that. I had no problem just suggesting, would you like to fly with Brad? Would you like to fly with Todd? And switch them off. And they found, hey, the magic happened and they were able to progress. I take nothing out of that as an insult. That my job is to serve them, not for them to serve me. And if flying with somebody else does it, go for it.
Yeah. Let me just real quickly, Christopher is saying, if I were to test for color blindness, a soda, what would it be like? Never did one. Christopher, this is not a Stump the Ambassador. I know exactly what the answer is, but it's not terribly difficult, but it's something that it's more than I can just tell you kind of in a quick soundbite here with everything we've got to cover tonight. So as I had suggested with Connor, send me an email, pat.brown@aopa.org, pat.brown@aopa.org, and I'll be happy to tell you exactly what's involved in that special medical flight test, which is what they call it now, for a color blindness issue. Okay, be happy to do that for you.
And there's no bloodshed in that. It's actually a fairly simple process. It's nothing to be intimidated by.
It's not hand-to-hand combat, I promise you.
Bernard C. says, people are as individual as personalities are to CFIs. That's just what we were talking about. And, people communicate differently. Some people, I mean, probably not me, but some people talk a lot. Thanks, Pat.
Really?
Some people, they're very stoic and quiet, and they get more from reading. That's the thing, and one of the things I always loved about aviation, Pat, maybe you did too. Nobody ever really asks you if you like that other person. Just go do your job. Teach them to fly. Go in there and learn from the other person. Be the FO, be the captain. Just work together and find a way to do it. I actually like that part, and it's kind of one of the interesting challenges because everybody you fly with has a uniquely different personality, different concerns. They all know something you don't know. That's been my case anyhow.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you with it all. The issue I always had, and I mean, I was an independent flight instructor, and then I opened a flight school, and then I kind of went back to being an independent flight instructor and ended up being a DPE. But as an independent flight instructor, you have a little bit of freedom to just be able to say, you know, something, I don't think I'm going to get along with this guy. Or this male or female, it doesn't really matter.
Mhm.
I don't want to fly with that person. And okay, you know, the only thing that's going to affect is my income. However, if you work for a flight school and you're paired with Joe or Jolene, and you just don't really like those people, you that's a little bit different situation. You might talk to your chief and see if you can get somebody reassigned, but that might not be an option.
Mm.
Just
Hey, we
tough it
got
out.
an interesting question from Kawakawa. Talk on Tach time, please. I'm happy to cover that. There's two ways we measure airplane time. One of them is Tach time, the tachometer, and there's a number that rotates in there. That's based on oil pressure, and that's what maintenance is based on. So when you see engine oil change 50 hours or TBO on the engine at 2,000 hours, that's based on Tach time. 100-hour inspection is based on Tach time. Hobbs time is actual time from the time you turn the engine over till the time you shut it off. So Hobbs time is what most flight schools base their time on and what most pilots base their flight time on. Tach time is just for maintenance. Generally speaking, everything is generally speaking. But I hope that helps.
The other thing about tach time is that the tachometer, the clock in the tach, actually runs concurrent with the speed of the engine.
Yeah.
So it's going to turn over quicker the faster you fly. The more RPMs are turning, the faster your tach time is going to turn. Whereas Hobbs time, every 6 minutes, that's 1/10. Every 6 minutes, it's 1/10, just like clockwork. So that's the reason you can typically go a further interval between maintenance if you're doing it on tach time, as opposed to Hobbs. Typically, about 1.2 tach would equal about what the Hobbs time would be for logging purposes. If all you have the tach in the airplane, about 1.2 tach time is about Hobbs time.
Yeah, if you start out with a brand new engine in an airplane with 0 on the tach and 0 on the Hobbs, those two numbers will separate fairly quickly, and the Hobbs will always be a bigger number than the tach time. But it's a great question. Great one, Kawakawa. Pat, how did you, I've never asked you this. We've never had this conversation in the 37 years we've known each other. How did you become a CFI? I mean, what was the incentive, and how did you go about it?
I'm a CFI. I thought that was a nightmare that I was waking up from. You know, it was, I won't say that it's by accident, but when I stopped flying in, I guess it was about 1987 or 1988. I quit flying just for the reason every other rusty pilot quits flying, and didn't come back to it. And by the way, I had 323 hours on my logbook. But I came back to it in about 1994, and I was looking for some inexpensive ways to learn how to fly. So I got my tailwheel endorsement, which is an odyssey on its own, and began flying as a tow pilot, volunteer tow pilot for a club here in Houston, the Greater Houston Soaring Association. That's houstonsoaring.org, by the way. And I thought, well, that would be kind of fun to learn how to fly gliders. I had a little bit of glider time, but I never took the check ride. So I took my, since I had my commercial power certificate, I went ahead and got my commercial glider certificate. Once I got that, I could start giving rides to people that came out. And I found out I enjoyed being in the back seat, talking to people through various, maneuvers and things like that, letting them fly the airplane, coaching them through it. So I thought, well, let me get my CFI for gliders. And at the time, you had to go to the FAA for any initial certificate that you had, except there were a handful of people in the United States that were not FAA employees where you could get your initial CFI as a glider instructor. And one of those gentlemen happened to be at the glider club that I was a member of. And so my initial CFI was glider. A couple of years later, I added airplane. A couple of years after that, double I, and then I added a multi-engine rating, and then the multi-engine instructor thing. And just one thing led to another. And before I knew it, people knew I had my CFI ticket, and they were calling me for flight reviews and things like that. And that's really all I ever intended to use it for, just flight reviews and the like. But then, things happen, and you start getting more phone calls. You get busier and busier and busier, and then boom, poof, here you are.
That's the coolest thing. I appreciate you telling that story. There's so many different ways to get there. As I said, I went to a couple really poor flight schools where
Yeah.
I spent a lot of money and didn't get much back.
Yeah.
Eventually, I did go to what I refer to as big time flight school, where I've still got friends from that. And it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And they've all gone on to great careers. I thought I was going to be an airline pilot. This was a career change for me. As you know, Pat, I had left my band and cut my hair and started acting like a normal human being and got into aviation. But I really thought the only way you could earn a living as a pilot was as an airline pilot. And the way to get there was being a CFI.
Right.
So I did go to big time flight school and just full time. My wife stayed elsewhere and I went to flight school. My initial ride was my instrument instructor.
Mm-hmm.
They had it structured so that we got our instrument instructor, then our MEI, our multi-engine instructor, and we got our CFI last. I think that was to keep you in the mix. So because you're not going to get a lot of multi-engine time if you don't have a CFI first.
Right.
But it actually worked out really well for me. And through that process, I found out that there are other things you can do. It's not just being an airline pilot, which didn't really appeal to me. I just thought that was the job.
Right.
I loved the GA side, the general aviation side, piston powered stuff. I just absolutely loved it. And that's where I've stayed for my whole career. And like you, I used to work actively as a flight instructor. I worked for a number of flight schools. I managed a couple flight schools. And now it's like, in addition to my AOPA job, I do flight reviews here and there, and I'll work with somebody in a tail dragger or something like that, just because it's fun. And frankly, I don't even care if they pay me because I have brain damage, but I just have a good time with it. So,
yeah. Well, I got to tell you, I have every hour. Well, let me rephrase that. In my logbook, I have about 90 minutes of turboprop time. And that was in the right seat doing a flight review for a guy. Every hour, every minute that I have as PIC, as flight instructor, except for that 90 minutes, is all piston. There's not a bit of jet time in there. Mm-hmm. And I'm a little bit proud of that, because I did it the hard way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you brought up flight reviews, and I mentioned flight reviews, and you and I teach the Rusty Pilot program, which is the ground portion of a flight review, mandatory for all pilots. Every 24 months have to do a minimum of 1 hour ground instruction, minimum of 1 hour flight instruction. Have you found over the course of your career that there are some misconceptions on the part of your clients on what a flight review is or why to do it? And I mean, what's your experience been like?
Well, it's not so much why to do it, because the FAA says you will, and that's enough. But as to what it consists of, as you said, it's an hour, minimum hour of ground, minimum hour in the air. And it really is very much almost what do you want it to be. One of the things that I ask even today when I do flight reviews is, what do you feel like you're weak on, both from the academic side and from the piloting side? Where are your weaknesses? And usually the client will have a pretty good idea of what he or she really needs to work on or unsure of, and they'll come back to me and say, well, maybe airspace or maintenance regs, who knows, or most of my time is spent flying cross country. I really rarely get a chance to do short field landings or stalls or steep turns or something like that. One of the things that I incorporate in my flight reviews most of the time, depending on the airplane we're flying, but most of the time, is the so-called impossible turn. And one of the questions I'll ask is, have you ever done the impossible turn? And most everybody knows what that is. It's where basically you'll make the turn back to the airport if you lose your engine. And many times the answer is no, unless they've done a flight review with me in the past. Then the answer is yes. But we'll go up and we'll set, for example, 1,000 feet as the hard deck, and we'll pitch for best rate. And at 1,000 feet above that, I'll just ease the throttle back and we hold the nose pitched up for about 5 seconds and then dump it and start the turn back to the airport. And we'll practice that 2 or 3 times, and they come away with an appreciation that, oftentimes it's kind of automatic. Well, if I get to 1,000 feet, I'm just going to turn back to the airport. And we can disabuse them of that theory very, very quickly, depending on what airplane we're flying. So that's kind of getting off topic a little bit, but mostly it's asking them what they feel they're weak on. And if they say, well, I don't know, whatever, trust me, I have things that we can do. Christopher, let me just, before I turn it back to holy Jamie, let me address Christopher Ritchie. Tach versus Hobbs. What about connecting a ground power unit? The thing about the Hobbs is it depends on who wired the Hobbs into the airplane. Some Hobbs are wired to the master. As soon as you turn the master on, 6 minutes starts clicking. Some of them, as Jamie said, according to the Tach, are plumbed into the oil pressure so that the Hobbs doesn't start turning until the oil pressure is at a certain point in the engine. So question is, how is your Hobbs wired? And then you'll have the answer to your question.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges, and it is a CFI conundrum. There are very few answers that are absolute in all cases. There's some gray area to everything. And you're right, Pat, on the flight review, when I'm taking them myself, I actually try to have fun with it. I've done them in tail draggers and tricycle gear. I've done them in seaplanes, high wings, low wings, single engine, multi-engine, because it's an instructional experience. I actually want to learn something from the guy I'm flying with or the woman I'm flying with, because they do know something I don't know, at least about this airplane. And by the way, Mike Robert asked if I bought an airplane yet. I think that's in reference to a series I did on how to buy an airplane. I did not, Mike, because due to unforeseen circumstances, I had to buy a car. And because of unforeseen opportunity, I'm in the process of buying a house. So I'm just going to get through that. And then we'll look at an airplane again later. I've owned 6, but I would like to have something. But, the thing about the flight review, I sometimes find people come in more nervous than they should be and worried that I'm really judging them. And I mean, I am evaluating, but I'm not judging them, because we all make mistakes. We all have misunderstandings. One of the things I'll do, and I'll bet you do this too, Pat, if I'm flying with somebody who's based out of a non-towered airport, you can bet there's going to be a diversion to a towered airport during this flight, because I want to see how you function with the radios. And if you're based at a towered airport, there's a pretty good chance we're going to divert to a non-towered airport, because I want to know if you know how to get in and out of that pattern correctly without disturbing the flow. And that's kind of the whole thing. If you do mostly short local sightseeing flights, that's one flight review. If you fly a bonanza, cross country, long distance on business, that's a completely different flight review. So it's really, I guess I didn't realize this until I became an instructor and started seeing a lot of people in the flight review realm. It's really about you. It's not about me. And while the practical test standard or the airman certification standard is the guide to what are the limits to this, it's not a test. You can't fail. So if I were to say to somebody, hey, let's go over here and do 8s on pylons, and they say, I haven't done that in 25 years, I wouldn't know where to start. Okay, that's not a failure. That's a learning opportunity and a discussion. Your thoughts, Pat Brown?
I totally agree with you, Jamie. It's about the applicant or the learner, the client, as the case may be. And that's the reason that, again, the first conversation I typically have with them is, what do you think you need to work on? And then we go from there.
One of the things I think people maybe don't realize they need to work on, and Frank is watching from Nigeria. I think he was on here last time, if I'm not mistaken. You're worldwide, Pat. They're coming from you. They're coming for you. I know it's not me. But one of the things I think people do misunderstand, and they think it's a huge leap to go from a Piper Warrior to a Cessna 172 or back and forth, because one's a high wing, one's a low wing. But they think going from one 172 to another, or one Warrior to a Cherokee to an Archer is all the same. And it's really not, is it? Every airplane is unique to itself, especially after 30 or 50 or 70 years of modifications.
Yeah, I mean, speeds and things like that are going to be fairly similar. Flight profiles are going to be fairly similar, but generally speaking, they're going to handle um, reasonably similarly. But beyond the handling is what kind of radios do they have in them? What's the avionics setup? I mean, this is up and this is down and this is left and this is right. But if you've got a Garmin 750 XI in there and the other airplane has a Garmin 750 that hasn't been updated to the XI, the knobology is different. Not much, but if you don't know it, it'll cause you some grief. So just little things like that.
Yeah, and if you've been flying an airplane, we use the term glass cockpit. If you've been flying an airplane that's got a G1000 and the other plane's got a glass cockpit, you go, oh, okay, but that's an Aspen glass cockpit. That's a whole other ballgame.
Oh, yeah.
I see now, I'll see, steam gauge airplanes, same type of airplane, pardon me, with a glass cockpit. And it really throws me back to, I used to own a 1977 Cessna 172N model, November model, great airplane, just terrific. But it still had the original 1977 panel in it. It hadn't been upgraded. Had LORAN, Pat, which was very whiz-bang cool in 1977, totally useless in the 21st century. It had a cassette deck built into the panel. So, I mean, there are flavors, and probably you may have run into the same thing I did. When I learned to fly, when I started, and in my first several years as a flight instructor, every airplane I flew had an ADF in it.
Oh, yeah.
And we did NDB holds and NDB approaches. Not a chance you're going to do that these days.
Well, there's an airplane that I flew the other day that had an ADF in it. So,
really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it works. Turn on the local AM radio station and get the news.
I was down in Miami at the end of the first Gulf War at a training facility for a major airline. And I went down to fly the sims during the overnight. I was there like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning when there wasn't a lot going on. But they were packed up with pilots because they were going to the Middle East to pick up soldiers and bring them home. And they only had NDB approaches there. And many of these guys hadn't flown an NDB approach since they got out of school. They were all ILSs back then, and now we're RNAV and that sort of thing. Yeah. It's kind of entertaining how much it changes. And the technology is absolutely great. And maybe that's worth talking about as well. For all the value of the technology, you can let it lull you into complacency. And that's something we always have to warn our students about. And we find in our students who aren't really consciously thinking about it, you can just become a slave to that magenta line on the GPS. And I know I'm on the line, but I don't know where on the line, and I don't know what's in front of me. I just know about my destination. So when that GPS locks up or we have a power failure, they're totally flummoxed because they've been relying so much on the instrumentation. They haven't really been keeping track of where they are. Have you had any experience with that?
Oh, gosh, yes. As a matter of fact, I was doing an instrument check ride with a guy 6 months ago or so. And we were flying an LPV approach, a GPS approach into a local airport. And the GPS lost its signal. And it rarely happens, but it does happen. And to his credit, he called up ATC, declared the missed, went back around, set up for the localizer approach to the same runway. And guess what? He passed his check ride. Along a similar note, a couple of days ago, I was doing an instrument check ride for a guy, and I'll be darned if there wasn't a DPE-induced GPS failure just about the time we entered the hole. And he totally fell apart. And I wasn't trying to trick him, but I did want to know, did he have any situational awareness, or was he just going to follow the magenta line around in the hold? And turns out that he didn't have any situational awareness, and we have to teach, or we have to test for that kind of stuff. So you better know where you are if you're going to rely on that that magenta line. And a good way to do that, and I know you know where I'm going with this, Jamie, is to triangulate with the VORs in the area, dial from radial, and wait till that needle crosses, and here I am. Ship that corroborates where the GPS says I am on my 4-flight moving map or whatever you're looking at, and just triangulate during your flight to confirm that that's where you think you are is where you really are. And if you do have a failure of some sort, at least you've got a leg up and you can report to ATC with some confidence as to where you might be. So
let me decode the term DPE induced power failure. That is when the designated examiner or the CFI sees that you're not using a device to be helpful, you're relying on it and can't function without it. If that's what it appears to us, we know where the circuit breakers are. We just might pop one. And that's a legitimate thing for a CFI or for a DPE. Because our job is to make sure you know how to handle the airplane without that device. And that started for me way back in the days of LORAN. And I'll tell you, it was often in the case I would take an aircraft owner on a flight review at their request. And, we'd do all our stuff, get out in the practice area. I'd put them under the hood. I'd fly them around and everything. And then, okay, you can take the hood off and take me home. And if it appeared they needed the LORAN to get home, there was going to be a power failure on that flight. And exactly like you said, Pat, that does it. They're just rattled at that point. And generally, it's an eye-opener. They realize if they legitimately lost that device, they'd be in trouble. Now, I'm going to ask you about a technique, Pat, and we have never discussed this. There's been no pre-planning at all. This is live on the air. If you are totally lost, if you just don't know where you are, I agree with you on the triangulation. But I learned a thing a long time ago, and I legitimately want to know your opinion on this. I advise people to enter a standard rate turn so you're not trucking off into a restricted area or Bravo airspace or something. You know where you are right now is okay, even if you're lost. Enter a standard rate turn and stay in it until you figure out where you are and where to go. Does that make sense to you, or do you have a different system?
No, I mean, I guess really almost any technique works. I mean, I think yours is perfectly okay. You can actually throttle back and slow down a little bit so you're not getting lost at a faster speed.
Yeah.
So
don't know where I'm going, but I'm making great time.
Making great time. That reminds me of the Italian airline pilot gets on the PA and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I got some good news and some bad news." He says, "First, the bad news is we're lost. Now for the good news, we're making a good time." But I just always makes me laugh. Anyway, I mean, I like the idea of triangulating on GPSs. I mean, if you really do lose your on VORs, if you really do lose your GPS, with the minimum operational network out there, which basically means that anywhere in the United States above 5,000 feet, you're supposed to be able to get a VOR, which is a part of the minimum operational network, or MON. I really like the idea of, if you can, climb so that you can get a VOR and then do some triangulation. It will get you very, very close to where you are. Now, remember, those radials kind of spread out as you get away from the station, but still, you'll have a pretty good idea of where you are if you're able to triangulate on a couple of different VORs. That way, at the very least, get one VOR and determine the from radial and see, at least I'm along this line somewhere. And worst case scenario, I can either turn to the from heading and fly away from it until I see something I recognize, or dial it around to the to heading and turn and fly to it until I find something. In worst case, you're going to get to the VOR, in which case you really do know where you are.
Yeah, and if triangulate's a great term because it really does work. If there are two VOR stations out there in the world, if you tune in one and center the needle with a from indication, the line you're on from that one, then do it to the other. Where those lines intersect, that's where you are. It's not that tough to do. So it's great advice. Now let's talk about record keeping, because going back to my early experience, my first couple flight instructors were just like, yeah, let's go get in the plane and fly around. They never talked to me about the practical test standard back then, the airman certification standard now, which is the test. These are all the tasks and areas of knowledge you're going to have. They never talked to me about what the flight was going to be beforehand. They never talked to me about how I did or gave me homework for the next one. We talked a little bit about the structure of a lesson. But, one of the realities is a lot of people who are flight instructing will move up the ladder to another job, a corporate job, a freighter job, an airline job, a feeder job. So your flight instructor, no matter how good they are, might not be your flight instructor all the way through. And one of the things I hated, Pat, was I would get a new flight instructor at one of these schools, and their attitude was like, well, let's go do a couple lessons and I'll see where you are. And I didn't realize I'm paying for them to get up to speed on where I am, instead of just opening up, back then on paper, opening up a pamphlet and going, oh, you've finished lesson 8. You had a little trouble with things on lesson 6. Let's go work on that and get moving. What's your preference for how to track a student's progress, whether you're going to keep that student or not, so that you're both aware of how things are going?
Yeah, there's probably 100 different ways to do it. Talk to 100 different instructors and you'll probably find 100 different ways to do it. There are some online applications that kind of help you just kind of track like where we are. When I was actively instructing a lot, frankly, I had just a manila folder, and I had a lined piece of paper that it was taped to the front of the manila folder. And after each lesson, I made a note of what it is we did and what's coming up next. And I would have that folder with me when I'd sit down with the student, and we would look, okay, so last time we did this. This is what I told you to expect this time. Let's talk a little bit about that before we go do it. And then it would repeat the process over and over and over again. And but AOPA has a new thing called AOPA Flight Training Advantage. AFTA is the acronym, and it's not really like anything else that's out in the market. It is a totally customizable way that you as the instructor and the learner, the student, can keep track of where he or she is in the process. And if there, I see Donnie put up the link there. If you are a student pilot, or if you are especially an independent flight instructor at a school that doesn't have a good way of tracking students, or if you're at a school, of any school that doesn't have a good way of tracking students, you might turn your students on to the AFTA flight training advantage there. It's pretty slick, whiz bang, iPad based. It doesn't work with Android. It's an iPad based thing. And, that's just kind of a high level look at it, but I would strongly recommend looking into that as a really, really good way to make sure that everything you need to cover is covered. There's a lot of links within the various lesson plans on that thing that send you to FAA documents like the Airplane Flying Handbook or the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge or what have you. So it's pretty slick.
Yeah, one of the fun things about being a You Can Fly ambassador is we get a sneak peek at this stuff and get to work on it. And when it's still in beta stage, we get to play with it. And I got to admit, I fell in love with this right away, because this is the exact problem I had as a student. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know there were structured lessons. And the AFTA thing, Adapted Flight Training app, is cool because not only am I a Mac guy, so I've got iPads and all of it. It would have given me the ability to see where I am, where I'm needing work, where I'm good. And it also has links to videos or reading material or whatever. My thing was turns around a point. When I was a private student, I couldn't do turns around a point to save my life. S's across the road, no problem. Rectangular pattern, I got it. Turns around a point, I just suck. It was an egg-shaped oval mess every time. It really would have been great to have some ability, as a neophyte, not knowing where to look, not knowing what to read, where there were already links in. and maybe you like this too, Pat. I really do, because as a CFI, I have some good resources, but as a student, I don't have a lot. And AFTA is owned and controlled by the student. It's used by the instructor in the flight school to keep them on track and help them out. But the student owns the subscription and can really make the most out of it. That's pretty cool.
It is, and if I'm not mistaken, there's a 90-day free trial or something. I don't recall exactly, but it's a pretty cool application. Bernard C., I think, raises an interesting question, Jamie, if I can revert back to an earlier topic here. He says, with all these new fandangle glass, a lot of pilots don't carry charts. So no phone, iPad, electric, AC failure, where are you? You and I have had this conversation over rusty pilots from time to time, right?
Many times, yeah. And we used to be on different sides of this, and then you bullied me into coming over to your side. Actually, you know what it was? In all honesty, the thing that did it for me is sectional charts update every 56 days now, and I'm not going to go hunting down new charts every 56 days.
Yeah.
I'm with you, and Bernard's got a very good point. What if the technology fails? But I've got GPS in the panel. I've got ForeFlight on my iPad. I've got ForeFlight on my phone. I think you fly with 2 iPads.
I fly with 2 iPads, a couple of batteries, a couple of charging cables. I've got in-panel power in the airplane, and that's not to say that all of that stuff can't go bad. But I got to tell you, if all of that stuff goes bad, the GPSs fail and everything else, I got bigger problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is not true of IFR flight. That's a different thing. But if you're VFR, I really do believe you should be able to fly the airplane with nothing. Just look out the window, hear the engine. And this comes from an experience I had many years ago with a really remarkable student I had, a girl named Marcy, who was just the best student I ever had. She was fantastic. But we were flying out of a non-towered field, and up the valley in Connecticut, another airport, 10, 12 miles away, somebody was just freaking out on the radio because their airspeed indicator stopped working. And, maybe a bug flew into the pitot or something. Who knows?
Right.
But they were really on the verge of panic. And I turned the radio off so my student's not getting worried. And I was the king of suction cups. I just covered up everything on the panel. And I said, we're going to go around the pattern a couple times. You uncover anything you want. And I'll be within, 100 feet, 10 knots, whatever private pilot standards are. And she was just amazed. And the truth is, if you fly enough, yeah, you can do it just looking out the window. You know what the right pitch attitude is. You know what the right sound is for the RPM rating you're looking for. You know how to trim the airplane up pretty close when you're on final, so you're in the ballpark. I really think it's worth being able to just look out the window and fly the airplane if everything dies. But as you say, if I lose GPS and iPad and iPhone and everything else, we've had something significant happen. This flight might not be the most important thing in the world.
You reminded me when you talked about that story that you just told me, reminded me when we had our flight school. I was in the traffic pattern with a student one day, and the radio comes to life. It was a non-towered field, and the pilot was declaring an emergency on the Unicom because his airspeed indicator had quit working. I'm saying he declared an emergency. I have an emergency situation. My airspeed indicator is not working anymore. And I looked at my student, and he looked at me, and it was like, really? It's an abnormal situation, but it's far from an emergency. And we monitored the situation as he was calling and making his calls and things like that. And he landed and he ran off the runway. Put the airplane in a ditch because he didn't have an airspeed indicator. So,
yeah, once the rubber hits the asphalt, the airspeed indicator is not really that big a deal. Just looking out the window. Let's hit a couple questions here. William Della Camara. No, it was not Chester. It was Robertson. I used to fly out of Meriden Markham and Hartford Brainerd, and this particular guy freaking out was up at Robertson, and that was over 30 years ago, I believe. James Hyatt says, I don't have iPhone or iPad, prefer Android. good for you. So does Pat.
Yeah.
72% of people have Android. Seems they're missing out on not having the same program for Android. There is a reason they don't have the same thing for Android. iPads are made by Apple. The OS is absolutely rock solid and well known. And every time there's an update, they check it to make sure it all works. There are variations to Android because those are licensed. So there's really no way to affordably create the updates and know that they're going to work across the board. And it's irresponsible to tell a pilot to take a piece of tech up in the air and use it if it may or may not work. So that's why they have that.
However, if you want to use Android, you have Garmin Pilot, you have FlyQ. There are, boy, I'm drawing a blank right now, but there are 3 or 4 Avare, Avare. There are several of them out there that are bilingual, that'll work on either iPad or an Android or Android only. So yeah, Avare, James Hyatt mentioned that one. So if you're an Android guy, and I'm an Android guy through and through, except that I do have 2 iPads that I run ForeFlight on, because I happen to like that application, and it's a rock steady platform to run them on. But I get it. If you like Android, and I do, there's nothing wrong with using Garmin Pilot, WingX. WingX was the other one I couldn't think of. FlyQ. And there's 2 or 3 others, maybe more out there, including Avare. So anyway, your mind.
Yeah, and I will say, Pat was very helpful in getting me to leave my Luddite ways and stop carrying paper charts and go to the electronic flight bag. I am diligently working on him to make him an Apple user. Someday I will convince him. It might take a while, but I am working on it. By the way, I want to go back to a topic we talked about a little while ago. Mike Robert has a really good comment. I was talking about flying with flight instructors who, oh, we need to go do 2 or 3 hours to see where you are. And Mike says, I had a lot of that milking for cash, I guess. I don't think that's always it, Mike. And it frustrated me when I found out how much money I had wasted flying to get somebody else up to speed who frankly wasn't that dedicated to my success anyhow. I think it's because they've never been mentored. And I could be wrong on this. And Pat, I would like your input on this. When I became a CFI, and I went through a really good program at a really good school, all my friends there have been very successful. We had study groups, and we studied back at home at night. We spent all day at the airport. It was a good environment. We got our CFIs, but we had no idea how to be CFIs. Those of us who became really successful ended up working at a flight school, and we all became flight instructors. We all began working at a flight school where there was somebody there who had more experience, who taught us how to do the job. The license, the certificate gives you the legal privilege to do the job, but that doesn't mean you know how to do it. And I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of CFIs who have never been mentored. And they have the certificate, and people come out and treat them like professionals, and, oh, you're godlike, you're a CFI, I want to learn to fly. And just out of ignorance, they start doing things that are wrong, and there's nobody to tell them differently. And again, that's part of the reason I like the AFTA application, because it gives the student a reasonable amount of power in that relationship, and knowing that, wait, there's supposed to be a structure to this. It's not supposed to be haphazard. Pat, do you have any background or experience with mentoring others or being mentored early in your career?
Well, yeah, first, just to reply to Jeff W. here, trying to find a good flight instructor scares me. Actually, what should scare you is trying to find a bad flight instructor. So, and they are out there, unfortunately. And they are out there. This is probably not a direct answer to your question, Jamie, but I think some of it also comes back to a lack of confidence. It's not, and in some cases it's just milking for the hours and the money, that no doubt. But I think a big part of it has to do too with just confidence. I remember the first time that I soloed a student. I don't know who was more nervous, me or the student, and it took a while for me to develop the confidence to know that when I got out of the airplane, the student was really ready. and to pump up a student to make him or her realize that they were really ready to go. And that perhaps that's a function of well, it's certainly a function of experience, but maybe you can help that with a mentoring type of a program. Maybe not. I wish I had a good answer for that one.
Well, and I was surprised to learn as a CFI, this is just my perspective, I thought as a CFI, I was supposed to be a great pilot. And I didn't realize I'm actually supposed to be a great teacher. When I worked at a 141 flight school where you'd go flying with somebody from the FAA every 6 months, which is like a flight review, but they're evaluating you. Sometimes I flew the entire flight. Sometimes I never touched the controls. It depends who the FAA sent out, who I was flying with. And I kind of realized over time and working with my chief flight instructor, who was a great mentor to me, my job isn't to be a great pilot. It's to help you learn to be a safe pilot. And that involves the way I explain to do something is going to be different with different people because the language just affects them differently. And, teaching somebody how to do something, like landing pat when we get to the round out, to the flare, and shift your eyes down the end of the runway. They're nervous. They don't want to do that. And your demeanor, how you explain it, having them follow you through on the controls and feel it, then having the confidence to let them do it badly, frankly, and you have the confidence, I can dig this out up to a certain point, and it becomes a training thing. But I think you're right. To some degree, it's a confidence thing. To some degree, it's a misunderstanding. I'm thinking I have to be Bob Hoover, and I don't. I need to be Mr. Cotter, dealing with the sweat hogs. I need to be the great teacher. I'm not here to do loops and rolls. I'm here to teach you to be safe.
One of the lessons I learned early on as a glider instructor was that words matter. And I may have told this story before, I don't remember. But I was trying to teach a fairly new glider pilot how to fly on the toe. In other words, basically we're on, here's the glider, here's the tow plane, and you're doing like this. Basically you're in formation about 200 feet behind the tow plane. And what would happen is invariably the glider would get this big PIO, and it's exactly what it was, pilot-induced oscillation going. And I would grab the stick and I would just say, look, I'm going to put the stick here. If we have to make a correction, just make the correction and neutralize the stick. Make the correction, neutralize the stick. You understand? Oh, yeah, I understand. And then what would happen? Back out to here again. And this happened multiple times over the course of a couple of different flights. And he finally said to me, what do you mean by neutralize the stick?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, bring it back to the center position. Turns out that he was an old military guy. Neutralize meant kill.
Well, that's the thing. You're right. And even something as simple as we're flying with somebody and they're building up airspeed and losing altitude, and we say, pick up the nose. That doesn't necessarily translate to people. To us, that makes all the sense in the world. Yeah. Being able to say the same thing 45 different ways really helps.
Yeah, unload the elevator, unload the wing, unload the elevator. What?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's one of those things you learn through experience if you're trying. If you just fall into a rut early on and go, wow, I get a lot of crappy students. They just don't learn well.
Yeah, a good flight instructor ought to have multiple ways of explaining any given thing.
Yeah. And, for me, a lot of it happened at the picnic table before or after the flight. And I must say, throughout my flight instruction career, I have always loved the time in the airplane and the variety of airplanes I've gotten to fly with a variety of students, some famous, some not, some really good, some just never got it. Yeah. But, you're right. You've got to be able to, I think one of the reasons that picnic table thing is true for me, at the picnic table, at the desk in the office, whatever, they're not afraid and they're not under pressure. Right. And I know when I started flying, I did put myself under a lot of pressure. You could be talking to me through the whole flight. I might have heard 20% of it. because
terrible classroom cockpit.
yeah, and I must admit, I use that in my own teaching now because I did have instructors who would try and teach me a concept in flight. That's not the place to teach a concept.
No.
Teach it on the ground. Use a flight sim to get the mechanics of it down, then use it in the airplane. But if you don't have a sim, do it sitting in a chair and then take it to the airplane. Because you're right, Pat, that is a lousy learning environment. It's loud, you're up high, you're moving fast, and you are so far behind the airplane as the student, you're just trying to not kill the two of you.
And you're operating in 3 dimensions.
Yeah. I remember, it's interesting you say it. I remember the first time I tried to land an airplane, and having been a ground pounder all my life, I knew forward and back, left and right. You throw in up and down, that's a whole lot of new information. That was a shocking thing. And I will tell you, my first solo, Hartford, Connecticut, many, many years ago, I was landing on runway 2. I was flying a Warrior, and I was stupid high. I mean, just way high. I had gotten excited and turned my base too early. I'm slipping as hard as I can. I have flaps in. This is not working out. I was humiliated to have to accept that I'm going to have to go around because I'm coming up on the threshold, and I'm still 700 feet in the air.
Yeah.
I do a go around. I fly down the runway. I do the pattern. I go a little farther out before I make my base turn. I land, and the tower calls and says, "Is that your first solo?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And they're like, "Good job." And it really meant the world to me that wasn't a failure. A lot of things that we think are failures, that was just good judgment. Don't force it. It's not working.
Good aeronautical decision making. I'm telling you something. The go-arounds are never a bad thing. Actually, I was doing a check ride a couple of days ago, and the wind was just howling. And, I kind of wondered when we took off, has this guy really made a good decision? And we were coming back to land, and he got hit by a gust when we were about 5 feet off the ground, and he was starting a round out already. And he said, don't like it going around. And you know what? He passed the check ride. First of all, his landings were acceptable, but he exercised the PIC. I've said it before. PIC stands for pilot in command, not everybody now, passenger in crisis.
Yeah, there's truth to that. By the way, we got 805 Echo Victor, a CFII from New Mexico, who is enjoying the presentation. I think he's enjoying your part, Pat. Mine he's just putting up with, but welcome to the party. I like having you here. I'm originally from Arizona, so New Mexico, we're right in there. I like that. Well, Pat, this has been absolutely wonderful, as it always is. The hour just flies by chatting with you. We both really love being a CFI, and we've covered a lot of ground and dealt with a whole bunch of questions. Is there anything in particular you would like to pass on to, whether it's a flight student, whether it's somebody who's getting ready for their flight review or worried about their flight review, somebody who wants to add on a rating and maybe start looking at this as a career? From your 187 years of experience in aviation, is there anything you'd like to pass on that might be beneficial tonight?
Well, man, oh man, where to start? I have my book of, whatever it is, have fun. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're not having fun doing what you're doing, you ought not to be doing it. A flight review should be a learning experience. It shouldn't be something to be dreaded. It shouldn't be something to be feared. You can't fail a flight review. The worst case scenario is the instructor might say, something, we're a little rusty on a couple of these things. Let's fly again a couple of times or a time or something like that. Just make sure that we've got all this stuff ironed out. At the end of the day, he or she is doing you a big favor, because if you turn you loose too soon and you put your family in the airplane and something happens, that's not a desirable outcome for you, for your family members, for your instructor, for your student, for your school, for the insurance company, for the FAA, because as the FAA is fond of saying, nothing happens until something happens. So that would be my 2 cents. It took us right up to 1 hour and 12 seconds.
Oh my goodness. What do you know? Well, hey, our next one of these is Tuesday, March 8th at 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific. Donnie is such an on the ball producer. He's already got it up there on the screen. I really appreciate y'all being here. It's just been great. Hopefully on March 8th, Kay will be out of that traffic jam and she'll be able to join us because she adds a lot to these. And I think I'm pretty much done, Pat. You got anything else you want to throw out there before we depart?
I got nothing.
All right. I like that. That's my favorite. Folks, it's been a pleasure. It always is. Hope we see you back here. Remember, we'll be on the Facebook AOPA page, or we will be on YouTube on the AOPA live channel, second and fourth Tuesday of every single month. And of course, keep in mind, Sun and Fun is coming April 5th to 10th. So if you're coming, stop by the AOPA little campus and say hey, because I'd love to meet you in person. And, you can meet Pat another time. Until March 8th, we'll see you next time. Have a great night, y'all.